This podcast is for the beginning of Unit 7, Revolution and Nationalism, where we'll be combining chapters 14 and 15, the main ideas, and kind of we look today at how these are all central figures to this time period between World War I and II. And we discussed how this was a time period of different revolutions and nationalism spreading, and we said some of these people will take this time period, take advantage of it, and use it to gain power for themselves and for their own desires. While we said, as example, Gandhi would push for independence for India in a more nonviolent and the non-aggressive way. So we'll look at these different figures and the changes they had on their countries, and we did journal number 1 to look at violent versus nonviolent actions and which ones brought about more lasting and meaningful consequences. And this podcast will focus on chapter 14, section 1, revolutions in Russia. And we discussed that Russia had, for over 500 years, been a country that had a central authority with the Tsar, and people didn't have many rights, if at all. They were peasants, and the feudal system still was in existence, and that there had been some opportunities for change. We talked about like Catherine the Great and Alexander II, maybe suggesting they would free the peasants, but none of this had materialized. And so by the mid-1800s, we see that the people of Russia were very upset. There had been attempts at revolution. There had been actions taken to try to get the government to pay attention, and it wasn't working at this point. And so a revolution happening in Russia seems very likely soon. And one of the ways that we see this, kind of the anger towards the Tsarist rule, is after Alexander II is assassinated, Alexander III comes into power and puts very strict control, which angers many people in Russia. So any reforms that Alexander II had promoted are going to be erased. And things that he would have focused on would have been using censorship. We said the schools were an area to target those that spoke out against the Tsar and the government. Any non-Russian groups and religions were banned. And we even talked about the pogroms against the Jewish population in Russia were encouraged. And so really it was the idea that what was Russian was supposed to be what was highlighted, and anything else was seen as was bad. And it was a way to kind of make the groups within Russia stand out, those that were in the minority, and it gave the Tsar maybe like an outlet for people to, say that's our problem and not the government at the time. Now, Nicholas II really kept up with these strict autocratic, and lack of reforms, but some of the things that he did do was to allow for a little bit more industrialization. And some examples of that would have been the Trans-Siberian Railway was built, and by the early 1900s, this will be established, and industrialization picks up. But with it comes a lot of the negative aspects of industrialization. We said that, going from a peasant to a worker in a factory is not going to be a huge improvement for many people. They still worked long hours, received little pay. And so it kind of builds then a base for a revolution of those industrial workers, which they call the proletariat. And that kind of goes along with, we said, Karl Marx's idea that the proletariat would one day overthrow that upper class. And many groups at the time thought that the ideas of Marx were kind of spoke right to them. And two groups formed, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. And the more radical group that Vladimir Lenin will lead will be the Bolsheviks. So dealing with a lot of these internal problems within Russia, we also see some more external problems exist, and there's 3 big crises we look at between 1904 and 1917 that really pushes Russia to the edge of revolution. The first one is the Russo-Japanese War, which we discussed before in a different unit, but in 1905 we talked that the world was kind of shocked as Japan beat Russia and won control of Korea and Manchuria, and it was very embarrassing for Russia at the time. In 1905, another action will occur where the innocent people will be killed by the Tsar's guards as they are walking to the Winter Palace to protest their lack of food and kind of more equal rights. And Nicholas II, to try to calm a lot of the violence that follows this Bloody Sunday, will allow for the creation of the Duma, which is a parliament. It was Russia's first parliament, but he quickly dissolves it after he sees that, that people are asking for more rights and he's not willing to share that authority with them. And then World War I is really kind of the final event that we'll see Russia move into a revolution over. And Russia was very unprepared for the war compared to the other countries. We said it lacked industrialization, that they had heavy losses from the beginning. Within the first year, they talk about at least 4 million people dying or becoming prisoners of war. And the family itself, Alexandra and Nicholas II, they weren't necessarily seen as being very good rulers of Russia at the time. One, for being a part of the war, and also for some decisions that were made. Eventually, Nicholas will move to the front to direct the war, and Alexandra is going to be seen as someone that makes a lot of the decisions herself without Nicholas around, and that she lets a gentleman by the name of Rasputin to make a lot of those decisions for her. He was around because she believed he had healing powers and helped her son, and she really truly felt that he was kind and he cared about the family, and so she let him have a little bit maybe more of part of government than she should have. But this kind of leads to her downfall, and eventually Rasputin will be murdered. And this kind of fear that she has is that all the things that he had spoken of, had come true, his predictions, and now she's afraid. One of the predictions he made was that if someone within her family helped to kill him, that her family would die within 2 years, and actually that does come true. So in March of 1917 will be the first revolution in Russia, and the Tsar will be forced to step down in March of 1917 as people upset with the war and what was going on at home with the lack of food and fuel. They'll go through a revolution, and soldiers that were at once protecting the Tsar will join the workers. Nicholas and his family will be, he'll have to abdicate, he'll give up his throne, and then eventually Nicholas and his family will be executed later on, but he'll be the last Tsar, that family. The original revolution in March will give way for they call it provisional government. So it's like a temporary government led by Alexander Kerensky, and the idea of bringing more reforms and giving people more power was a big part of this government. But one thing that this government did that people didn't like was continue its participation in World War I. And so throughout Russia, these groups were forming. They called them Soviets, and different groups were forming throughout Russia within these little Soviets, which were actually becoming more powerful than the provisional government at the time. And in April of 1917, right after this is forming, Germany arranges for Lenin to come back to Russia. He had been away for over 17 years, and this was kind of Germany's way of helping to promote unrest within Russia and kind of finally force them out of the war. So when Lenin comes into Russia, he leads the Bolsheviks in gaining control of many of these Soviets, and their military guards would be called the Red Guards. And they eventually will come in November will be the second revolution in 1917, and they'll kick out the provisional government. And like, for instance, Kerensky will have to take off, and he'll even live in the United States for most of his life, but he'll leave. And now the Bolsheviks have gained much of the control throughout Russia. And some things that Lenin does to change Russia that at first sounded very good for the people of Russia is that peasants had some land. So he distributed the land among peasants. This whole idea of the workers overthrowing the upper class was seen as workers got to have some of the control of the factories. And one of the most popular things that he does is he signs a treaty with Germany saying that he would give over some land to Germany in order and then be done with the war. And so that was popular among Russians. So at first, it didn't seem as though Lenin was doing anything negative. In fact, many people spoke of the Russian Revolution as being, this perfect revolution. They were going to actually create this utopia on earth. And so many people, even those that had been prisoners of war or had moved from different countries into Russia during the war, wanted to stay and see this happen. But it wasn't going to be easy for Lenin. The Red Army that he would lead, the Bolshevik army, will eventually have to defend itself against the White Army. And the White Army were many people that wanted to kind of reestablish what had been the social order under the Tsar And many countries helped support it, including us. We supported the White Army because we didn't want to see communism win throughout Russia at the time. During this time period, about 14 million people will die during the Civil War. Eventually, the Red Army will be victorious, and so in 1921, Lenin now has the power, and he tries something that doesn't sound a lot at all like communism. They call it the New Economic Policy, and basically it allowed for some capitalism. So small farmers and small store owners could sell their goods for a profit. So, and even encouraging investing in foreign countries and trade, which is very different than what we see as communism today and even following Lenin. And one of the big political changes that was made in 1922 was there will no longer be a Russia. The map will now say the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or we'll call it the Soviet Union too. And all those different Soviets that were made up become part of these self-governing republics. And the Bolsheviks no longer exist as a party. It's now called the Communist Party. Now, Lenin will have a stroke in 1922, and he'll eventually die in 1924. And there will become a struggle for power. And so Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin will be the two going back and forth to gain power. And we're going to look at Stalin's eventual victory and how he changes the Soviet Union in the next section.